So here we are at the bottom of page 25, folks. Let me just get us rolling, Mayhair, and, for the first couple paragraphs, okay? The new humanity will come into existence in the release of love through the spiritual awakening brought about by the masters. Love cannot be born of mere determination. For through the exercise of will, one can at best be dutiful. One may, through struggle and effort, succeed in bringing his external actions into conformity with his conception of what is right, but such action is spiritually barren without the inward beauty of love. Love springs from within, in no way amenable to force. Love is essentially self-communicative and its own evidence. Those who get love from others make response, which is of the nature of love, unconquerable and irresistible, gathering power and spreading until it transforms the whole. Humanity will attain to a new mode of being through the free interplay of love from heart to heart. Redemption through divine love, subtitle. When men recognize that there are no claims greater than these of the divine life, which includes everyone and everything without exception, love will establish peace, harmony, and happiness in social, national, and international spheres, and shine in its purity and beauty. Divine love is the expression of divinity, and through divine love, the new humanity will be in harmony with the divine plan. Divine love will not only introduce imperishable sweetness and infinite bliss in personal life, but will create a new era. Through divine love, the new humanity will learn the art of cooperative and harmonious life. It will free itself from the tyranny of forms and release the creative life of spiritual wisdom. It will shed illusions and get established in the truth. It will enjoy peace and abiding happiness. It will be initiated into the life of eternity. Mayhair?
Jai Baba, nothing on the screen. The
Slowly,
search,
Mayhair, please, okay?
Yeah, sure.
Thanks a
The
lot.
search for God. Most people do not even suspect existence of God. Others, through early upbringing or the influence of tradition, belong to some faith and acquire belief in God's existence. From education and their surroundings, their faith keeps them bound to rituals, ceremonies, or formal beliefs. but rarely brings about a radical change in their lives. There are others, philosophically minded, who have inclination to believe in the existence of God, either because of their own speculations or because of the assertions of others for them. God is probable, hypothesis, or an intellectual idea. They do not, however, know God from personal knowledge, and God is not to them an object of intense desire. Direct knowledge of spiritual realities. A genuine aspirant to the knowledge of God is not content with the spiritual information based on hearsay, neither is satisfied with infantile knowledge. For him, spiritual realities are not merely the object of thought, and their acceptance or rejection is fraught with moments, implications. He searches for direct knowledge. This attitude may be illustrated from the life of the great sage who was discussing spiritual matters with a friend who was advanced upon the path. While they were thus engaged, their attention was directed to a dead body being carried by the side. This is the end of the body, but not of the soul. The friend remarked, "Have you seen the soul?" asked the sage. "No," was the answer, and the sage remained skeptical about the soul, for he insisted upon personal knowledge. But through the aspirant cannot be content with second-hand knowledge. He does not close his mind to the possibility of spiritual realities that have not come within his experience. In other words, he is conscious of the limitations of his own individual experience and refrains from making it in the measure of every possibility. He has an open mind for things beyond the scope of experience. If he does not accept them on per se, he does not entertain activities, disbelief in them. It is true that the limitations of experience tend to restrict the true scope of the imagination, and a person comes to believe that there are no realities other than those within his experience. But as a result of some incidents in his life, he may become open-minded. This stage of transition may also be illustrated from a story from the life of the same sage who happened to be a prince. Someday after the incident already referred to as, he was riding on a horseback. He came upon a pedestrian coming towards him in his way and arrogantly ordered the man to let him pass. The pedestrian refused, so the sage got down from his horse and entered upon the following conversation. "Who are you?" asked the pedestrian. "I am the prince," answered the sage. "But I do not know you to be prince," said the pedestrian. I shall admit you as prince only when I know you to be a prince and not otherwise. This encounter at once awakened the sage to the fact that the god may exist even through he did not know him.
So subtitle.
Man
Oh.
indifferent to the existence of God. God either exists or does not exist. If he exists, search for him is just justified. Even if he does not exist, there is nothing to lose by seeking him. But man does not usually turn to search for God as voluntary and joyous enterprise. He has to be driven to the search by a disillusionment about worldly things from which he cannot detach his mind. Ordinarily, man is engrossed in activities concerning the material world and lives through its experience of joys and sorrows without suspecting the existence of a deeper reality. He aims the pleasure of the sense and avoids sufferings. Eat, drink, and be merry. Merry is his philosophy, but he cannot entirely avoid suffering. And even when he succeeds in having pleasure, he becomes satisfied while he thus goes through the daily round experience. There arises occasions when he asks himself, "What is the end of this?" Such an occasion may present itself in some happening for which he is not mentally prepared. It may be disappointment in some confident expectations or important change in his situation demanding radical. Will somebody take it from there?
Okay, just to finish that sentence, requiring radical readjustment and the giving up of cherished habits. Usually,
Giving up the cherished habits, usually such occasions arise from the frustration of some deep craving of which is processed. Under such circumstance, a person may be driven to despair. And if the
no, you were correct up here.
Okay.
Repeat this, please. Yeah.
Okay. Usually such occasion arise from the frustration of some deep craving of which he is possessed. If that craving has no chance of being satisfied, I don't know how to say this.
Psyche.
Psyche receives a shock that may cause it no longer to accept the life that hitherto has been lived without question.
Thanks so much, Meher.
Welcome. Jai Baba.
Jai Baba. Ralph, could you unmute, please, and read?
Okie doke. Under such circumstances, a person may be driven to despair. And if the tremendous power generated by the psychic disturbance remains uncontrolled, it may lead even to serious derangement of mind. Such a catastrophe overcomes those in whom desperateness is allied with thoughtlessness, for they allow impulse to have free sway. Desperateness can only work destruction, but the desperateness of a thoughtful person under similar circumstances is altogether different, because the energy released is intelligently harnessed and directed towards a purpose. In the moment of such divine desperateness, a man may take the important decision of discovering the aim of life. There thus comes into his life the search for lasting values. Henceforth, the question that refuses to be silenced is, what does my life lead to? Divine desperateness, the beginning of spiritual awakening. It's the heading of starting a new line of thought. Divine desperateness, the beginning of spiritual awakening. When the psychic energy of man is centered upon finding the goal of life, he is using the power of desperateness creatively. He is no longer content with the fleeting things of this life and is skeptical about the values he has so far accepted. His desire is to find the truth at any cost, and he does not rest satisfied with anything short of it. Divine desperateness is the beginning of spiritual awakening, because it gives rise to the aspiration for God realization. In the moment of divine desperateness, when everything seems to give way, a man may decide to take any risk for realizing the possible significance of his life. All the useful solaces have now failed him, but at the same time, his inner being refuses to reconcile itself with the idea that life is devoid of meaning. If he does not then admit some hidden reality that he has not hitherto known, there is nothing worth living for. The alternatives are that there is a hidden spiritual reality, which prophets have described as God, or that everything is meaningless. The second is unacceptable to a sane man. Therefore, he must try the other. This man turns to God. Shall I continue, or
Yes,
do you
yes,
want to-
please. Yes, please.
Revaluation of experience. Since there is no obvious access to this hidden reality, he looks upon his experiences as a possible avenue to an explanation. And thus goes back to those experiences with the purpose of gathering light upon them. This involves looking at everything from a new angle of vision and entails a reinterpretation of experience. Now the seeker not only has experienced, but tries to fathom its spiritual significance. He is not concerned merely with what it is, but with what it means in relation to this hidden goal. And this revaluation of experience results in gaining an insight which could not have come to him before. Revaluation of experience amounts to the acquisition of wisdom. And each addition to spiritual wisdom brings about a modification of the general attitude of life to life. So the purely intellectual search for God or the hidden spiritual reality has its place in the practical life of man. His life now becomes an experiment with perceived spiritual values. The more he carries on this intelligent and purposive experimentation with his own life, the deeper becomes the comprehension of its meaning, until he discovers that in undergoing a transformation of his psychic being, he is arriving at the perception of the significance of life, coming to oneself with the clear and tranquil vision of the real nature and worth of life. He realizes that God, whom he has been seeking, is no longer a stranger, is no stranger. He is the reality itself and not a hypothesis. He is the reality seen with undimmed vision, the reality in which he has had his being and with which he is identified. So, though he begins by seeking something new, he arrives at understanding of an ancient thing. The spiritual journey does not consist in gaining what a person did not have, but in the dissipation of ignorance concerning himself and life, and the growth of understanding, which begins with spiritual awakening. To find God is to come to one's own self.
Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you.
Rosalie Margaret. Ooh, sorry. You have to unmute yourself, Rosalie Margaret.
I don't have to go on because I've reached it.
That's a good one.
Yes, it is. It's a God one. God realization. That's that strange noise.
Not sure. Let's mute myself and see if that's.
You must be hearing things.
It sounds like from a horror film. God realization. To arrive at self-knowledge is to arrive at God realization. The dog. Can someone mute their dog? God realization is different from all other states of consciousness because they are experienced through the medium of the individual mind. Whereas God consciousness is not dependent upon the individual mind. A medium is necessary for knowing anything other than oneself. For knowing oneself, no medium is necessary. In fact, the association of consciousness with the mind is a hindrance to the attainment of realization. As the seat of the ego, the individual mind is conscious of being isolated. From it arises the limited individuality. You've gone too far. You're too far. As the seat of the ego, the individual mind is conscious of being isolated. From it arises the limited individuality, which at once feeds and is fed by the illusion of duality, time, and change. To know the self as it is, consciousness has to be freed from the limitation of the individual mind. In other words, the individual mind has to disappear while consciousness is retained. Throughout the life history of the soul, its consciousness grows with the individual mind, and the workings of consciousness proceed against its background. Consciousness comes to be firmly embedded in the individual mind. So when the mind is in abeyance, consciousness also disappears. The interdependence of the individual mind and consciousness is illustrated by the tendency to become unconscious when there is any effort to stop mental activity through meditation. The explanation of sleep. The phenomenon of sleep is not essentially different from the lull of consciousness experience during meditation, though it is different in origin. As the individual mind is continuously confronted by the world of duality, it is involved in conflict. And when wearied by its struggle, It wants to lose its identity as a separate entity. It then recedes from the world of its own creation and experiences a cessation of consciousness. The quiescence of mental activity in sleep entails the submerging of consciousness. But this cessation of conscious functioning is temporary because the impressions that are stored in the mind cause it to return to renewed activity. And after some time, the psychic stimuli are responsible for reviving conscious functioning. So sleep is followed by wakefulness, and wakefulness by sleep, according to the law of alternating activity and rest. But so long as the latent impressions in the mind are not undone, there is no annihilation of the individual mind or emancipation of consciousness. In, excuse me, in sleep, the mind temporarily forgets its identity, but does not lose its individual existence. And when the person awakens from sleep, he finds himself subject to his existing limitations. There is resurrection of consciousness, but it remains mind-ridden. The obstacle of the ego. The limited mind is the soil in which the ego is rooted, and the ego perpetuates ignorance through the many illusions in which it is caught. The ego prevents the manifestation of infinite knowledge already latent in the soul, and is the most formidable obstacle in the attainment of God. A Persian poem says, "It is extremely difficult to pierce through the veil of ignorance, for there is a rock on fire. As the flame of fire cannot rise very high if a rock is placed upon it. A desire to know one's own true nature cannot lead to the truth as long as the burden of the ego lies upon consciousness. Success in finding oneself is rendered impossible by the ego, which persists throughout the journey of the soul. Though more and more detached as the soul advances on the path, it remains until the last stage of the seventh plane. The ego is the center of human activity, and the attempts of the ego to secure its own extinction may be compared with the attempt of a man to stand on his own shoulders. Just as the eye cannot see itself, the ego is unable to end its own existence. All that it does to bring about self-annihilation only adds to its existence, for it flourishes on the very efforts directed against itself. Though it is unable to vanish through its own activity, though it succeeds in transforming its nature, the vanishing of the ego is conditioned by the melting away of the limited mind, which is its seat. A little lower. Parallel between sleep and God realization. The
Oh,
meaning of
sorry, Rosalie. I was muted when I asked when I thanked you, and I asked Wendy K to unmute herself.
Parallel between sleep and God realization. The meaning of God realization is the emancipation of consciousness from the limitations of the mind. When the individual mind is dissolved, the related universe vanishes, and consciousness is no longer tied to it. Consciousness then becomes unclouded and is illumined by the infinite reality. While immersed in the bliss of realization, the soul is oblivious of objects in the universe, and in this respect, it is as it were in sound sleep. Excuse me. But there are many important differences between God realization and sleep. During a sleep, the illusion of the universe vanishes since consciousness is in abeyance, but there is no conscious experience of God, since this requires the dissolution of the ego and the turning of full consciousness towards the ultimate reality. Occasionally, when the continuity of deep sleep is interrupted, the soul may have the experience of retaining consciousness without being conscious of anything in particular. There is consciousness, but not of the universe. It is consciousness of nothing. Such experiences anticipate God realization, in which consciousness is freed from the illusion of the universe and manifests the infinite knowledge hidden by the ego. Difference between sleep and God realization. In sleep, the individual mind continues to exist, though it forgets everything, including itself. And the latent impressions in the mind are a veil between the submerged consciousness and the infinite reality. Thus, during sleep, consciousness is submerged in the shell of the individual mind, but has not yet been able to emerge out of that shell. So though the soul has forgotten its separateness from God and has attained unity with him, it is unconscious of unity. In God realization, however, the mind does not merely forget itself, but has, in brackets, with all its impressions, lost its identity. And the consciousness hitherto associated with the individual mind is freed from trammels and brought into direct unity with the ultimate reality. Since there is no veil between consciousness and the ultimate reality, the soul is fused with the absolute and eternally abides in knowledge and bliss. The manifestation of infinite knowledge and unlimited bliss in consciousness is, however, confined to the soul that has attained God realization. The infinite reality in the God realized soul has excuse me, the knowledge of its own infinity, but such knowledge does not belong to the unrealized soul, still subject to the illusion of the universe. If God realization were not a personal attainment, the entire universe would come to an end as soon as one man attained God realization. This does not happen because God realization is a personal state of consciousness belonging to the one who has transcended the domain of the mind. Others continue to remain in bondage and can attain it only by freeing their consciousness from the burden of the ego and the limitations of the individual mind. Thus, God realization has a direct significance only for the one who has emerged from the time process. What was latent in the infinite becomes manifest. After the attainment of God realization, the soul discovers that it has always been the infinite reality, and that it looks upon itself as finite during the period of evolution and spiritual advancement was an illusion. The soul also finds that the infinite knowledge and bliss that it enjoys have been latent in the infinite reality from the beginning of time, and that it becomes manifest at the moment of realization. Thus, the God-realized person does not become different from what he was before realization. He remains what he was. The difference that realization makes in him is that while previously he did not consciously know his true nature, he now knows it. He knows that he has never been anything other than what he now knows himself to be, and that he has been through a process of self-discovery. The process of attaining God realization is a game in which the beginning and the end are one. The attainment of realization is nevertheless a distinct game. There are two kinds of advantages. One consists in getting what we did not previously possess. The other consists in realizing what we really are. God realization is of the second kind. However, there is an infinite difference in the soul that has God realization and one that has not. Though the soul that has God realization has nothing it did not already possess, its explicit knowledge makes God realization of the highest significance. The soul that is not God realized experiences itself as finite and is constantly troubled by the opposites of joy and sorrow. But the soul that has realization is lifted out of that and experiences the infinite.
Thanks, Wendy. Ernie, please.
In God realization, separate consciousness is discarded and duality is transcended in the abiding knowledge of identity with the infinite reality. The world of shadows is at an end, and the curtain of illusion is forever drawn. The distress of the pursuits of limited consciousness is replaced by the tranquility and bliss of truth consciousness, and the restlessness of temporal existence is swallowed up in the peace of eternity. Four, aspirants and God realized beings. Before God realization, advanced aspirants pass through states of consciousness that are akin to the state of God realization. For example, Mad Must and the saints of the higher planes are completely desireless and immersed in the joy of God intoxication. Since their only concern is God, they become the recipients of the happiness that is characteristic of the God state. They have no beloved except God. They have no longing except for God. For them, God is the only reality. They are unattached except to God and remain unaffected by pleasures and pains. They are happy because they are face to face with the divine beloved. Different states of aspirants. Advanced aspirants not only participate in some of the privileges of the divine state, they also possess occult powers and perceptions. They belong to different types according to the kinds of powers they possess. For example, on the first plane, the aspirant sees lights and colors, smells perfumes, and hears the music of the subtle world. Those who advance further see and hear at any distance. Some see the entire physical world as a mirage. Some take a new body immediately after death. Some have such control over the physical world that they can change their bodies at will. They are called Abduls in Sufi tradition. But all these achievements pertain to the phenomenal world, and the field of their powers is itself a domain of illusion. And the apparent miracles they perform do not in themselves mean that they are nearer to the God state. In their consciousness, too, aspirants belong to various types, get intoxicated with extraordinary powers, and in the temptation of using them, have a long pause in their Godward march. They get held up in the consciousness of the intermediate planes. There are some who become dazed, confused, and self-deluded. There are some who get caught up in a coma. There are some who with difficulty try to come down to physical consciousness by repeating some physical action or an identical sentence a number of times. There are some who in their God intoxication are so indifferent to the life of the physical world that their external behavior appears to be that of mad persons. And there are some who cross the path while performing their worldly duties. Owing to their exalted states of consciousness, Some advanced aspirants are adorable, but their state is no way comparable to that of God realized persons, either in respect of the spiritual beauty and perfection of their inward state of consciousness, or in respect of their powers. All aspirants to the sixth plane are limited by illusion. They are mostly happy due to their communion with God. For some, the joy of the inward companionship of the divine beloved is so great that they become unbalanced in behavior, and in their unsubdued state of God intoxication may abuse people.
Ernie,
stone-
Ernie, sorry, you missed a line. Could you go from here again?
Sure, sorry about that.
Thanks.
All aspirants to the sixth plane are limited by finite consciousness and are in the domain of duality and illusion. They are mostly happy due to their communion with God. For some, the joy of the inward companionship of the divine beloved is so great that they become unbalanced in behavior, and in their unsubdued state of God intoxication may abuse people, throw stones at them, or behave like ghosts. Their state is described as that of the unmata. Owing to the exuberance of uncontrolled joy and inward contact with the divine beloved, they are, regardless of worldly standards or values, and owing to the fearlessness which comes to them through complete detachment, they may often allow themselves such self-expression as would be mistaken for exaggerated idiosyncrasies. Poise comes on the seventh plane. Only when the soul attains God realization on the seventh plane does it get full control over its joy. Only with realization does the unlimited happiness, which is eternally his, in no way unbalance a person, for he is now permanently established in non-duality. No longer for him is the extravagance of newly found love. The occasional unsettlement due to the own flow of increasing joy at the closer proximity of God is also over, because he is now inseparably united with him. He is lost in the divine beloved and merged into him, for he is one with the infinite ocean of unbounded happiness. The happiness entered into by the God-realized person is unconditioned and self-sustained, eternally the same, without ebb and flow. He has arrived at certainty and equanimity. The happiness of the saints is born of proximity to and intimacy with the divine beloved, who, however, remains an externalized another. In the happiness of the God realized, there is no duality. The happiness of the saints is derivative. The happiness of the God realized is self-grounded. The happiness of the saints is that of the outpouring of the divine grace. The happiness of the God realized is the divine grace itself.
Thanks. Thank you, Ernie. Mahu, please.
Okay. Differences in relation to the universe. When a person attains God realization, He has infinite power, knowledge, and bliss. The intrinsic characteristics of inner realization are the same in all the God realized, irrespective of the differences that give rise to distinguishable types. These differences are extrinsic, belonging not to the relation with God, but to the relation with the universe. They do not constitute degrees of spiritual status between the God realized who are all perfect. Yet these differences exist only from the point of view of the observer. They do not exist for the God realized themselves, who are one with each other and with all existence. From the point of view of the outward creation, however, the differences between the God realized are not only definite, but worth noting. After God realization, some souls drop their bodies and remain eternally immersed in God consciousness. For them, God is the only reality, and the entire universe is zero. They are so completely identified with the impersonal truth that may have no direct link with the world of forms. Majzubs. Some God-realized souls retain their gross, subtle, and mental bodies, but in their absorption of God consciousness are totally unconscious of the existence of their bodies. Other souls continue to see their bodies and treat them as persons incarnate, but these bodies exist only from the point of view of the observer. Such God-realized persons are called majzubs in Sufi terminology. The majzubs do not use their bodies consciously because their consciousness is wholly directed towards God. It is not turned toward their bodies or the universe. For them, their bodies as well as the world of forms have no existence. So there can be no question of their using their bodies in the world of forms. However, though the majzubs do not use their bodies consciously, they are necessarily the centers for the radiation of the constant overflow of the infinite bliss, knowledge, and power, and love. And those who revere these bodies derive spiritual benefit from this radiation of divinity. Some God-realized persons have the awareness of the existence of others who are in bondage. But they know these souls to be forms of the Paramatman, and that they are one day destined to have emancipation and God realization. Being established in this knowledge, they remain indifferent to the provisional and changing lot of those who are in bondage. They know that just as they themselves have realized God, these also will realize him. They are in no hurry to spend up the God realization of those who are in bondage, for they take no active interest in the time processes of creation. God-men. Some of the God realized not only possess God consciousness, but are conscious of creation and their own bodies. They take an active interest in those who are in bondage and use their own bodies consciously for working in creation, so as to help others in their God, Godward march. Such a God realized one is called Sadguru or God-man. The Sadguru knows himself to be in the center of the universe, and everyone, high or low, good or bad, is at the same distance from him. In the Sufi tradition, this center is called Qutb. Through Qutb, the universe is controlled. Avatar. The God realized one who first emerges through evaluation as, as the God-man and help others in bondage is known as the avatar. I'll repeat this again. The God realized one who first emerges through evolution as the God-man and helps others in bondage is known as the avatar. Sadguru and avatar have complete God consciousness, plus full consciousness of vigorous, subtle, and mental worlds simultaneously, and have no difficulty in retaining normal human consciousness. But the Paramahansa and Jivan Mukta, who have no duty to perform, have at times great difficulty in keeping their consciousness normal and have to compel their minds to come towards material things and activities. They may ask for food or pull their hair or slap themselves to remain in the body. The avatar has no difficulty in retaining normal consciousness at all times. He does not have to resort to physical activities in order to keep in the physical world. In fundamental characteristics of consciousness, the avatar is like other God men. None retains a finite and limited mind, because after merging in the infinite, the mind becomes universal. And the God-man, as well as the avatar, never loses God consciousness, although engaged in activities in relation to the creation. Both work through their universal mind when they desire to help others.
Thank you, Maho. We'll continue here next week on chapter 5, The State of the God-Man. That's page 41 of the ebook. Let me stop the share. group
Eugene.
portrait.
Yeah.
And let me just turn off the recording. Give me a second. Where is it? Here. Thanks.